career spans global education, philanthropy, and social impact. And prior to Luminos, she spent more than a decade as a senior leader at the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, a role that took her to live in South Africa and India for many years, where she worked closely with local partners on education and social impact initiatives. Caitlin's work has long focused on what happens inside classrooms, particularly for children who have been excluded from schooling altogether. And at Luminos, she has led the development of an approach to accelerated learning that centers joy, play, and strong foundational skills. The work is deliberately curriculum-driven and deeply attentive to pedagogy, with a focus on inclusive learning environments where children feel safe, engaged, and experience the joy of learning. Teachers are not treated as technicians delivering a script, but as professionals supported with structured materials, coaching, and real-time feedback to respond to children's learning needs. She's also editor of the Luminos Method, copies of which she has generously bought to share with us today, so they're over there in the corner, we get them later, which distills what the organization has learned about designing playful, activity-based curriculum and supporting teachers to make accelerated learning work in low-resource settings. She's also no stranger to the IEDP, and two of our GSE alums actually work with her at Luminos Foundation. And we're really glad to have Caitlin with us today to talk about joyful learning, the role of play, and what it takes to support teachers and children who have been pushed to the margins of education systems. Please join me in welcoming Caitlin Barrett.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here, and Professor Mark, thank you so much for the extraordinary invitation and very generous introduction. So yes, I am the founding CEO of the Luminos Fund. We are 10 years into our journey of bringing rich, transformative learning opportunities to children at the margins worldwide. And the University of Pennsylvania and the Graduate School of Education have been very much on that path with us at Luminos from the very beginning. So I'm really excited today to have the chance to share with you a little bit about the Luminos journey and what we've learned along the way. I want to make sure we have a chance to touch on those powerful Penn connections. And then time permitting, because this is a bunch of wonky grad students, I've jammed a bunch of data in there at the end that we can all get into and unpack together if the schedule allows. I would say I welcome, is that okay? Good. I'm just going to set up that camera. Oh, okay, perfect. Excellent. It is super fun for me to have the chance to share our work and our journey with you. It is even more fun when you ask questions as I go. So just my encouragement to everyone is like, don't feel like we need to wait till the end. But we will definitely also have time at the end. But your questions are what I learned the most from. So I would just say, please jump right in as we go through. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. Oh, what? Do you want me looking there from time to time? Oh, amazing. Wonderful. All right. Well, without further ado, let's jump in. So, Luminos was founded 10 years ago to focus on one specific educational challenge. There are still 1 in 5 children on the African continent who miss out on the chance to start primary school, who really miss out on the chance to take that very first step on the educational journey. And Africa is the one region in the world where actually the number of children who are out of school is growing, and so it's a natural focus for our work. And just as a starting point, often folks will ask me, like, why are kids out of school? Why do they miss out on school? I think the example that's often top of mind for many of us is, are girls held home from school for, different conceptions about what girls' educational learning journey should be? And the answer to that is sometimes, although honestly in our context, girls are as likely to be out of school as boys. The simple reason most children miss out on school is economics. So in context where we work, even free education can be too expensive when parents need children at home to assist on a farm or to care for an ailing sibling or adult. But equally, we work in contexts of post-complex settings where often systems will be closed for many years at a time, leaving sometimes millions of children kind of years behind their peers, and struck with this challenge of how can we, in this pregnant moment in a child's life, enable them to catch up effectively and ultimately thrive. So that's where our work comes in. Our vision is a world where no child is ever denied the chance to learn. And we focus specifically on children who missed out on the chance to go to school, but we use that work as an anchoring point to understand children at the margins everywhere. Children who are left behind, whether they're in the classroom or outside. What does it take to provide rich, inclusive, catch-up education that enables each and every one of them to thrive? So a little bit about where we work. So we work in 4 countries in Africa and have an education emergencies program in Lebanon. And to date, we have reached 400,000 children. So situating our challenge, our task, in the sub-Saharan African context, these figures can be really sobering and stark to take in, but they're an important way to anchor the reality of the educational landscape in which Luminos works. And so again, as we had said, sort of 1 in 5 children in the African context miss out on the chance to go to primary school. But a far larger number, actually 70% of the whole, are in school, but are in schools that are not enabling them to learn at grade level. So they're in school, but they're substantially behind. And only 1 in 10 African children are really in school, and schools that are supporting them to learn at the level of their capabilities and their inherent abilities. And so this is the context we step into at Luminos. And for those who work in the international education setting, I think, we spend a lot of time citing these really stark, sobering statistics. There are so many children still being left behind, and those numbers are real, and we do anchor ourselves in that work. But often we don't ask, why is that the case? What is the reason behind that? And so, what we understand is that, quite honestly, the reason so many children are not managing to learn at grade level is because, quite honestly, we're asking them to do something extraordinarily difficult. So there are 4 key challenges or barriers that we think about in our work at Luminos. And one is that, first things first, most of the students we work with are first generation learners, right? They're children who are the first in their family to learn to read. And what does that mean? That means when they step into the classroom, it's the first time they're encountering print. It means that there's relatively little their parents can do at home to support their learning journey. So that means what happens in that classroom is far more important to that child's reading journey than, anything that we find in the US or European context where children are really encountering text and print long before they're in the formal educational setting. Secondly, children in most classrooms across not just sub-Saharan Africa, but much of Latin America and South Asia are learning in a sort of rote learning environment. That's not because of a lack of will or ambition on the part of teachers, but teachers themselves went to school and learned in that way. And so it's completely natural as they then step into the role of teacher that they would use that same approach. And I know for students here at Penn, you're all keenly aware of how limiting that approach to construction is. But more often than not, that is the reality that we find in most classrooms in most low-income countries. Another key piece of the puzzle is that most children are being asked to learn without a really structured, systematic, built from the ground up, phonics-based instructional model that importantly is written from inception in the language of instruction. So most countries in Africa nowadays are teaching grades 1, 2, and 3 in an African language. Often that's not the African language that the child in the classroom speaks. It's someone else's African language. But even when there is a match between instruction and language spoken, often those materials are developed by translating them out of English or French, which just linguistically means there are all sorts of limitations in how effectively one can do the early part of literacy instruction through translated materials. And finally, I mean, I think a barrier that many folks in this room will know and understand intuitively is that teachers are sort of on their own, right? They are often in a classroom with 50, 60 or more students, very little in the way of teaching and learning materials, and very little ongoing coaching or support. So teacher preparation is a fairly theoretical exercise that happens in a teacher college somewhere, and once you leave that teacher training college, that's really kind of the end of the classroom level support. So you can see when you look at barriers like this, right, it's actually not surprising that so many students wind up being left behind, because quite honestly, what we're asking those students to do are to bridge remarkable learning chasms, right? So in our approach at Luminos, we've really set about creating teaching and learning environments that actually leap over those 4 different hurdles. So I'm inviting you inside of a typical Luminos classroom. Right now, our classrooms are typically buildings with mud walls, tin roof. There's certainly no internet. There's definitely no electricity. So you step inside a classroom where the main light source is from an open door or a window. But what you find when you step into that classroom is, despite the very modest circumstances, all of the principles and practices of global learning science alive and well in a rich, interactive, multimodal learning environment. So I can take you on a little bit of a tour of this classroom. So first things first, because we're working with first-generation leaders, the program begins in a very methodical, step-by-step approach to literacy instruction. Importantly, that's written authentically from inception in the language of instruction. So we teach in 11 different languages. We never work with translated materials. We actually build from the ground up in the linguistic structure of the language of instruction. Rote learning is simply not a part of the process. We actually work really hard with teachers to empower them with a rich array of games, song, dance, all of which are drawn from the traditions of the village context in which we work, to really bring the learning environment to life. We actually have, this is a very cute illustration, because it's got here on the floor something that is it's a very common game in West Africa called the Wari board. Sometimes it's called the Mancala board in South Asia. It's a very common game that you'll find, especially older folks in particular, in rural Ghana where we work, will play for hours on end. It's a really, really great way to practice mental math. So it's one of those classic examples of when we design programs in collaboration with communities where we work. It's that idea of what assets are here, what elements of this set of communities' traditions can we actually bring into the classroom and make an integral part of the instructional program. And then yes, there's songs, there's games, there's dancing, there's lots of handmade materials. There's also some really bread and butter, solid phonics-based instruction, which is incredibly important, especially in African languages that actually have a let's call them more transparent orthography than English. So typically if you learn phonics in an African language, it will, each letter does more or less make the same sound over and over again. It's actually much faster for children to read when you take a phonetic structure in an African language, sort of in the same way that it is with Spanish. If anyone studied Spanish in school, you'll know that like Spanish spelling is a lot more predictable than English spelling. And the same holds true for most of the languages that we're instructing. So that's a great opportunity, right, is to really lean into the transparent orthography of most African languages and take advantage of it. And then there's ongoing coaching over time. So here's our teacher in this classroom. She's working with these students. But this gentleman is the coach, and he's in the classroom with her once a week, providing instructional support in real time. Hey, I see you struggling with how to explain double-digit addition. Have you tried this? Have you tried this approach? Equally, he's actually assessing a subset of students on their basic literacy and numeracy skills, capturing that information in his phone, and then when he's back under a cell phone signal, that data actually comes through to Luminos HQ, so that we have real-time information on which classrooms are struggling, which are doing well. We know which classrooms need more coaching and support, and which actually can run on their own. So those four elements really come together in Luminos classrooms to help us achieve the results that we want to achieve. So we will take a look at some of those results. What this approach enables is that children in just 1 year of learning can move from being out of school, having missed out on the chance to be in school, to actually being in school and learning at grade level. And this is incredibly important, right? Education is the most important work that we can invest in global development. It's also some of the hardest, right? It's not straightforward. We often say like, hey, there's no education vaccine, we don't hand out deworming pills. So the challenge of getting education right is uniquely difficult, but the payoff is unprecedented, right? When we get it right, children themselves are capable of learning a remarkable amount in a short period of time. It's actually on us, curriculum designers, program designers, and teachers in classrooms across the continent to make those learning opportunities possible. So Luminos is anchored in data. We've done over 30 external evaluations since we were founded 10 years ago. Some longitudinal evaluations, some RCT or randomized control trial evaluations. We had a really important RCT of our Liberia program back in 2023 that showed that a student in the Luminos program in Liberia was learning in just 1 year 90% of what the average Liberian learns in a lifetime. And so what's captured in that statistic? It's sort of two things. One, this is an incredible program led by amazing teachers who are delivering incredible learning opportunities to their students. And it also speaks to the reality that this is a country context that had a generational civil war where learning opportunities were lost to a whole generation of people. So children in this program are learning at a remarkable rate compared to the communities that they come from. And why is that possible? One is first things first, children everywhere are capable of incredible things, right? And secondarily, it's because there's a program that's really meeting them where they are, enabling teachers to understand children as individuals, not just a block classroom, and really accelerating their learning forward. So that was in 22-23. Time marches on. But this program has not stood still. And I like to talk about this a lot because we talk about the importance of RCTs and kind of proving a particular model or approach. And then that it kind of suggests that like, oh, kind of once you RCT this program, you're done. Like it's locked. Set it and forget it. Just keep like postage stamping out that same exact program because you've had a successful RCT. But that's never been our approach at Luminos, and the reason it's not is because children's capacity to learn is near infinite. And so organizations' capacity to iterate, innovate, and get better over time has to be continuous as well. And so I am thrilled to report that just 2 years later, we actually saw a further 79% improvement in the annual literacy rates of children in this program, which is such a powerful reminder that so often in global education in particular, because this work is hard, we've sort of conditioned ourselves to get comfortable with kind of incremental progress. The kids we serve deserve so much more than that, right? Actually, so much more is possible when you build really a learning organization that can achieve not just once, but every year, better results over time. So on the subject of data, we've also had the gift of a long-term study of impact. Because we run a program that is 1 year and delivers remarkable gains in 1 year, naturally the question I kind of get most often is like, okay, but what happens after that? So good news, 90% of the students who start the Luminos program successfully transition back to mainstream school and continue their studies. A few years back, we had the gift of a longitudinal evaluation conducted by the University of Sussex that actually followed graduates of the Luminos program for a full 6 years after they left. Which I think is such a gift if you think about kind of the life of the average classroom teacher, right? You have your students with you for 1 year, you give them everything that you have. You sort of hope for the best, but inevitably you, the teacher, have very little visibility into sort of what happens next. And so this longitudinal study was just a real gift to us and wound up showing that graduates of the 1 year Luminos program were going on to complete primary school at twice the rate of their peers. But I think most importantly, that over the long term, 6 years out, they had higher aspirations than their peers in mainstream school, and that they were happier and more confident in the classroom. This study was conducted for us relatively early on in our learning journey. It was a critical moment where I think we really anchored on this core philosophy, this central tenet of our work at Luminos, which is that children everywhere learn best when they're happy. Happiness is actually a precondition for learning. So a safe environment, a joyful environment, is in the end the only learning environment that's really going to unlock this kind of truly transformational learning gains. And it's one thing to sort of know that in your heart. I think it's a lovely thing to actually see that coming through in the data as well. Okay, so that's like a whirlwind tour of Luminos and our work, but today's session is particularly fun for me because it's been a great opportunity for me to kind of map out the full sweep and scope of the extent of Luminos' connections to the University of Pennsylvania. And so, as Professor Gopar-Kuchar had shared, we do have a long history with you. So I'd love to take a moment to deep dive into that. At that point, I'll pause and open up and welcome some questions. And then I do have another set of slides looking specifically at equity issues within the Luminos program that we've done over time that I would love to take you through as well. But first things first, I think the beginning of our journey probably maps back to 2021. The Whitman Prize, which runs out of the Wharton School, recognized Luminos as one of 3 awardees that year, and it was a critical year. So cast your mind back to the education world in 2021, right? Classrooms everywhere closed. Luminos was in the business of catch-up education, but we were actually doing very little active instruction anywhere because of the constraints on travel and assembly in person. And so this Whitman Prize came for us at a critical moment, right as classrooms were reopening, right as Luminos was essentially back in business. And if you sort of map the growth of our organization over time, there's a huge inflection point in 2021. Following this Luminos Prize, the recognition that came from that And that in that post-COVID moment, Luminos was able to scale our work significantly and substantially. But the fun thing is how many connection points we've had since then. So yes, two of your former students are integral to our team. Neha Rahil and Aishwarya Kapley both come from the School of Education here at Penn, both intimately involved in our curriculum design work. So all of the hard science that goes into creating these instructional materials that enable us to deliver these transformational learning. But just because we like to be creative, we also have a history PhD, who did a PhD in Ethiopian history, who is our technical specialist on our Ethiopia team. And we have a colleague who's pursuing a master's here right now with some generous support that originally came to us through MIT. So we're only a team of, because our team designs programs, and then we fund African-led organizations to actually take those programs to scale. Our team's not huge. I mean, we're still less than 70 people. So actually realizing that 4 of those 70 have a direct connection back to graduate schools at University of Pennsylvania has just been a really wonderful moment for us as a team. So a little bit more on Aishwarya and Neha's work. In Neha's time leading our teaching and learning team, she has overseen the creation of over 10,000 pages of teaching and learning material across, I think, 8 different languages of instruction. Absolutely brilliant curriculum designer, and we are so incredibly fortunate to have her leadership. And she's Aishwarya's boss. And so Aishwarya works on our team. She's a more recent hire, she's a more recent grad from the program. And it's been so lovely actually to have that deep anchor in the Penn Graduate School of Education approach in our curriculum design team, which obviously, as you imagine, like where does education begin? It begins with curriculum design. So they're both absolutely phenomenal Lumineers, which is what we refer to ourselves as, and really truly reflect the values and the ambition and aspiration of our organization. So I'm going to pause there for just a moment, and I would love to, I'm going to actually grab my water bottle at the same time, but I would love to take guidance from all of you, like what would be most interesting to hear more about? What kind of questions might what I've shared so far spark or bring to mind for you? Oh, and do you mind introducing yourself, just so I can get to know you?
Just like my name is Olivia. I'm curious about like the operation of Luminos, like specifically I know you guys have offices at different parts of the government. I'm curious how like let's say the office of the US coordinate with like teachers in Africa, how that communication works.
Yeah, it's a great question. So our team is relatively small, and that's really because our team are essentially curriculum designers and trainers, and then we're funding independent African-led NGOs to actually employ the teachers and set up the classrooms. So we don't have teachers directly on our payroll. We have essentially teacher trainers on our payroll. And we have a registered entity in each of our countries of operation in Africa. All of our Africa teams are 100% African-led. And we have a team of about, it depends on the size of the country, sort of 10 to 15 people per country. The country manager will lead the relationship with government. Obviously, education is inherently political work, right? So we can't work anywhere without a robust and well-aligned partnership with ministries of education. So the country manager will lead on that work. And then we have a team who are designing curriculum and running trainings, and then a part of that effort of being out in the classroom every week and running that coaching. We do have real-time data coming in on a weekly basis on student learning levels, which actually guides us as to which classrooms need more support. But in addition to that, so I can bring up on our dashboard at any point in time a dashboard of our performance in rural Liberia and tell you which classrooms are succeeding and which are not. So there's quite a lot of information. It's a very distributed system, right? Like, great instruction happens in the classroom, so there's no point like kind of centralizing and like pulling information too close, but we do need this very dynamic sort of two-way communication. And we have about 2/3 of our team together every single week on a staff meeting call, so it's pretty important when you're an organization that has a small sort of back office team in the US, but most of actual work of what you do is happening in an African context. If you don't create a global conversation, then the people actually doing the work are not going to get work. So technology has been a gift to us in a lot of ways. When I first started this work, it was a lot harder than it is now, and Zoom is not perfect, but it's still an amazing way to make sure that we're really, a holistic set of voices in the team are actually driving.
Hi, Nora. Going back to that graphic, you had said that children within 1 year of your program can go from that 10%, or from that 20% that are not attending school to the 10% that are actually learning. And I was just wondering, you had also said that those 20% that are not in school are not because of different economic barriers. So how do you recruit your students or get those 20% that aren't going to school for those reasons to be able to be in your program and overcome those barriers that they have? Do you convince parents that it's worth it, or?
These are really good questions, and I think it can be hard to imagine, like, what is it like for, if children aren't in school, why is that happening? What would it take to change that, right? And I would say, in particular, one of the first country programs we set up in the first year we were starting Luminos was a country in West Africa, Liberia, that at the time had the highest rate of out-of-school children in the world. So it was actually 60% of primary school age kids not in school. So that means when you're walking around, it's like more than 1 in 2 of the kids you're seeing are not in school. And when we were first, arriving in the context, we were like, gosh, we better do some research to actually understand parents' kind of mindset and values. Because like, gosh, that number is so high. Like, I wonder what's at play there. So anyway, this is not going to be surprising to anyone in this classroom, but we fielded a great study, and we surveyed a whole bunch of parents, and essentially 99% of parents said that getting a quality education for their children is one of the most important things to them. And so I think that's just like such a powerful reminder that we sort of think these barriers are a parental mindset, and in most cases they're really not. There's a very small number of specific cultural or geographic contexts where there could be unique barriers for girls in particular. It's not that common. It's usually that parents desperately want the best for their kids, and they're facing just a heartbreaking set of choices that most people sitting in a classroom at the University of Pennsylvania thankfully won't be spared from ever having to make. But almost every parent I ever meet in the context of our work will say, I'm so glad my child is in this program, because I always told him, I promise next year you're going to go something. And that is, that's real for every single one of these parents. And so but it prompts the question, I'm like, okay, but then why does this work? Because the school was there and they weren't there. And honestly, I think that's probably going to be me. That's a big party foul. How inappropriate is that, friends? Okay, well, they'll be going. Some of it is context specific, right? So we're working with children who are 10 or 11 years old. In most of the geographies where we work, that's almost the end of childhood, right? That's almost kind of, sometimes our programs are referred to as second chance programs, but in some ways they're kind of like last chance programs, right? Like children and parents know, like, gosh, this kid is 10 or 11, they're either going to learn to read now or it's maybe not going to happen for them, right? And so that is a big motivator to be clear. The most important thing is that we show them in a very short period of time that these students these are their clever children. These are the good students. So a lot of the students in our program they'll be living in a family context, but they might actually be a cousin, right? So it might be that the biological children of that home are in school, but they're from a less well-off part of the family. They've been sent to live with these relatives who are slightly better off, and they are working at home, cleaning or working on the farm, but they have a bunch of cousins who are working school all the time. And suddenly you see, aha, look what this child can do, look what's possible. And so that's one of the key reasons why we have parents and caregivers in the classroom from the first month, right? And so when you're helping children go from not knowing all the letters in the alphabet to, at the end of just 1 year, standing up and reading a full storybook end to end, right? Like even if you as a parent can't read, you can see with your own eyes how much this child knows. And quite honestly, that winds up being as big a motivator for why they stay in school. You know, I think why we get them in the program is because there's a lot of that sense of this is the last chance. But actually why they then transition so successfully and actually stay in school over the long term, as the data has shown, is really because of kind of changing both the child and the parent's concept of the capabilities of the child. I'm going to jump to the back of the room and we'll come back.
Hello, my name is Lee. I have 2 questions actually. The first question is, I'm curious about like how do teachers and then students themselves know that they are ready for the school after the program, so about assessment. And then I understand that there are different children with like at different ages come to the program. So when they come back to the mainstream school, are they gonna start from like primary level, like grade 1, or like they will match at their age at that grade?
Ling, that's a really great question. So we do an early grade reading assessment, an IGRA on the program every single year, and that's really what kind of drives our internal understanding of how students' learning is progressing. But again, education is a political endeavor. We work in a political environment, and so the actual placement in school is done by some sort of government set test, right? Because it has to be a test that is credible and is recognized by the ministries that we work with. So every student does take a placement test at the end, and that does route them to different grades. So children will typically go into 4th, 3rd, or 2nd grade based on how they place. And some of where children actually wind up in school literally does come down to which class has space. So I would just, to be clear, like we're working in really resource settings, so it is not a perfect science. And certainly there's a lot of pressure on older students to be in classrooms with other older students. So some of it is socially driven as well. And so the average age of children in our program is 10 or 11, but we go up to 14 and we go as young as 8. So we do see that range.
Hi, my name is Benji. We had some reading beforehand about Luminos Method, and in the reading I mentioned trying to expand the curriculum out to public schools, so like doing outreach and working with local domains. I have these like lessons in different science findings, but like I know these are working, I know these are successful. There's some students who are not finding. And I was just wondering if you could expand on that if there's some experience about how that process works, and also in regards to Luminos being a iterative company that is changing all of its approach.
Reggie, those are 2 really good questions. Okay, so what I would say is that over time, as we establish a track record and an evidence base in each country where we work, and quite honestly, as we build deeper and more authentic partnerships with ministries of education, inevitably more and more of our work is in mainstream classrooms with government teachers. So Ethiopia is our oldest program, so that's about 85% of the students we reach in Ethiopia right now are actually in classrooms led by government teachers. And we do, just as an organization, like, we believe seriously on the importance of evidence and context we think that's one of the big mistakes that we make in international education, especially in the RCT world, is to think like you tested one thing one time in one community and now this is the magic prescription for everyone. And part of the reason we put together the Luminos Method work was really saying like, there are principles and practices that are true everywhere. It's not like we go in with a complete blank slate, but so much of what's gone wrong with educational work that's been done on the continent in the past has been this idea of thinking you can like a lot of one kid and one app for everyone, children everywhere will learn to read. It really is that idea of context is pretty fundamental to what we do. On the iteration front, it really helps if we do the iterating kind of offline, like in our classrooms, you know what I mean? It's a lot easier for us to rapid cycle, make changes. We always feel like by the time you're working in government schools with ministries of education, you need to have a pretty bulletproof approach to instruction. Like you actually can't easily iterate within a government school setting. So ideally, like that's the gift of actually working with out of school children, is not just that you're helping those children get back to school, it's actually that it's a perfect kind of just to the side of the mainstream system kind of sandbox where you can actually figure out, okay, what really does work for teaching these children in this context. And then, so ideally when we're pulling something through to the mainstream system, it's pretty solid. And because we have an external evaluation of every country program every single year, there's just like a lot of data out there to say like, this is a proper program that's been externally assessed. But yeah, that is a privilege, being able to work that way. If we think about, the worlds of sort of USAID funded education projects, maybe in the past, those projects had a lot of strengths, but one of the real weaknesses that they had was it was typically a sort of, you win a contract for a 5-year program, you rock up in some country where you have no context and no team, and you sort of get started from year 1 before you really know what the heck you're doing. And then inevitably by like year 3 or year 4, you're really getting it figured out, and then by year 5 the project's closed, right? So the gift of being able to operate with philanthropic support is that whole idea of how can we start small, learn at classroom level what really works, and then like only be scaling things where we really know with confidence and certainty it's actually a meaningful
This really builds off Benji's question, and we've already talked a little bit about the links that Luminos goes to build from the existing context in terms of developing a curriculum without translation from languages and supporting the existing organizations, teachers, communities. But I was wondering if you have or can talk about an example of a context where you face some amount of local pushback in any way, and whether or not that created an opportunity for co-creation.
Okay, so that's a great question, and the short answer is like we face the pushback all the time. I think the more important answer is that everything that we do is a process of co-creation, and it is a careful dance. And quite honestly, I mean, the sort of easier path is to kind of start outside the system, iterate on a program model, have a real evidence base, and then invite government in to see what you're doing. And when it's a kind of finished product, and then if they're excited about it, then it's relatively, they sort of know what they're buying in a sense, and it becomes like a more, people have an easier time kind of signing up for it because they already see what it is. But when you're working in partnership with government, you also, like sometimes you just have to, sometimes they know a lot more than you do, and you don't actually see at the time what they see. And so you need to let it go and accommodate. And sometimes like you're right and they're wrong, but actually you're not going to move them off of that unless you just literally walk that journey with them. So actually in the Ethiopia program, we started moving more into the government setting, and then we're suddenly looking at programs that had to reach like tens of thousands of children as opposed to kind of the few thousand we've been working with. Like we had to do a lot more writing stuff down than we had before, right? We had this like beautiful kind of magical kind of let 100 flowers bloom type of project that really spun quite, creatively from the communities we were in. But if you're suddenly rolling that out across thousands of schools, you have to write stuff down. As soon as you have to write stuff down, it starts to feel like you're putting limitations, right, on the creativity of teachers. And so one of the things we did the first year we did on writing instruction, Ethiopia, is the government had said to us, that's okay, you can write stuff down, but we still want teacher choice, teacher agency. So we talked about a set of activities that were in an activity bank. We were like, we're going to have detailed all sets of activities, and then you, the teacher, are kind of picking and choosing how you're putting these things together. And we ran that for a full year, and at the end of it, the teachers gave us a bunch of feedback that was like, this is really nice, but also it's confusing, and I don't really know how to do this, and actually, if you could give me like a little bit more guidance on like which activity before what, that would be great. And then that's what changed it, right? Because then our government partners were hearing from their teachers, like, this is great, but it would be even better if it was like a little bit more methodical. And I think, it's the gift of having like somewhat flexible philanthropic money is like, and having really strong Luminos leaders in our country programs from the context that we're in. So my counterpart Alex, who runs our program in Ethiopia, our long-standing program, is like deeply, deeply steeped in it. He could just sit down and be like, yeah, the bottom line is eventually we're going to need to write this down more like an end-to-end book, but we're just not going to get people there right now, and we won't be honoring the relationship if we don't actually want this to work. So it was a huge gift to be able to essentially take a year that we knew we were going to have to go back and redo, and we had to renegotiate with the Peace Foundation. This is going to be a longer journey than you want, but if you really want a sustainable partnership, you really want a program that is authentically home to what we're working with, like this is what it is. And to their great credit, they were okay with it, but we did have to raise a bunch of money to make it happen. They weren't going to pay for the extra year, but they were okay to give us more time. All right, I'll take like 2 more questions right now, and then let's like look at some of this equity data, and then we can free things back up again as well.
My name's Priya. I'm curious about what you were talking about in terms of funding, because a lot of stuff on the is moving on very quick. When you're creating some context-specific programs, how do you decide where the money goes? Because I know some schools have like additional midday meal programs or safeguarding programs. And then a second question with that is, how does that affect how you create partnerships, like in terms of value alignment in local organizations? How does the partnership work?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the end, we are, like, our expertise is foundational literacy and numeracy, predominantly in African context. So when we look out at the scope of different things we could do, we're always trying to stay pretty close to, and I guess the calculus there is not that all of these other challenges aren't equally important, maybe more important. It's just like, are we the best people to support on that piece? The one exception to that is safeguarding, which is actually fundamental. We believe you actually can't teach children to read effectively if they're not in a safe environment. So that piece is fundamental for us, but sometimes we have a midday meal and sometimes we don't. And like, would it be better if we had it every time? 100%. Like, does anyone want to teach a classroom of hungry children? No. Is it like morally repugnant? There are hungry students in the world? Yes. But the reality is sometimes we don't, sometimes we don't. So there are some things like that will always be there, but there are things that aren't. So,
Hi, I'm Yufei. I have a question about the implementation part, especially for recruitment, because you have mentioned that a lot of students drop out because of their family, maybe in the low-income ones, and they may be orphans, or they are the first generation. So in the beginning of the project, how do you convince the parents when they send their children to this program children are also in the child labor part. Yeah, so I think maybe they are considering some of them foregone learnings also. So how do we help them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say the convincing part gets easier over time. So the program does inevitably build a reputation for itself in the communities where we operate pretty quickly. So inevitably, by the time we're there the second or third year, there's not much persuasion required. I mean, up until that point, like, parents should be asking hard questions, right? Like, who are these people rocking up in my village, and what do they have to offer? Like parental skepticism is a good thing. It's a healthy thing, right? It's the same questions I ask about my own kids' schooling. And I would say a lot of what parents are solving for is like using imperfect measures of quality, right? Like they don't have a perfect report card on how well their local school is teaching, but they know if the teacher shows up every day, right? And they know, over time, if they see children who go to that school learning, they do that too. So even when parents don't have kind of traditional data for understanding the quality of schools, they have pretty good kind of intuitive reads on what's a quality setting and what's not. A lot of how we attract students and retain students is because there's really great learning happening in the classroom. And I mention that because, I would say years ago, like when the SDGs first came out, there was this sort of sense in international education that somehow you were either working on access or you were working on quality, and some of these were two different things. But the reality is that those are actually one and the same, right? And like the better schools get, the more children want to be there, the more parents want to be there. We've definitely seen that in our experience as well. But there's not a lot of strong learning we're always going to communities that the government has prioritized. So we're going to areas where there's a large number of kids out of school. And we're always working in consultation with the community. And then we're always trying to design the program around the reality of that environment. So where we work in southern Ghana is an area with a lot of cocoa plantations and some mining. And the reality is like a pretty high proportion of the kids in our program are in fact like working for wages during the early part of the day. And so in our Ghana program, we actually run the program from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. It's just a 3-hour program, and it's at the end of the day, and it's sort of recognizing the reality that we are not going to solve child labor overnight, but every child also has the right to learn to read. And so if you're able to be really thoughtful about like, what's the actual lived reality? What are the actual like impossibly hard choices that these families are making? And I think you come to those choices from a standpoint of respect, not like I need to change this parent's mind, but like I actually need to understand this parent's journey and build around them. Then like amazing things are possible. So even in a setting where about 40% of our kids in Ghana are engaged in formal child labor outside the home, they are also some of our most dedicated students, and also transitioning to mainstream school at the same rate that we see more or less in other countries where child labor is not as big an issue. The funny thing with child labor is that there has to be like a formal economy, right, for child labor to be happening. So Ghana is actually like one of the wealthier countries we work in, but because the economy there is growing, child labor actually winds up being child labor outside the family farm winds up being more of an issue. Okay, we're gonna like look at a few bits of some equity data because I told Professor Wagner on the flight down, somebody handed me this really awesome paper he's written recently of creating like a Gini coefficient for education, which I thought was absolutely brilliant and completely fascinating. And education equity is near and dear to Luminos' heart, so I thought it'd be helpful to kind of let you guys in the kitchen a little bit on like how do we think about this and like what are we seeing in our data over time. And so, first things first, we're a program for marginalized children, right? So you could argue that kind of everything we do is about education equity. Of course, that's sort of the case, right? But I think what's been really interesting that we've learned from our data over time is like there are equity within equity issues, right? There's like round one, getting everyone into the program, but like round two, making sure everyone in the program learns at the same rate. And because we have the gift of like year-on-year EGRAs in kind of a similarly running program over many years, it's just like an interesting opportunity to kind of unpack some of that equity data. We always say that like data is fundamental to everything that we do at Luminos, but it's never data for data's sake, right? It's data that enables us to understand children as individuals and to drive greater results for especially the least of us. So first things first, like first the good news. This was really exciting in our Liberia RCT from 2 years back. So this was the first time we were doing from a standard deviation standpoint, looking at different subgroups and just walking you through some of this ID insight data here. So what we saw, well, first off, very robust treatment effects, which is amazing. But now then you look boys and girls, near identical, right? So those dots are in just about the same spot. Similarly, kind of younger kids, older kids, actually surprisingly similar results. You can see there's kind of a slightly bigger distribution of results for younger kids, which is maybe not surprising, but the averages are pretty darn similar. And then in those who've never been to school before versus those who've had some formal schooling and come back, I mean, you'd expect to see a bit of a difference there, and you do. But again, it's really not huge. And so one of the things the ID Insight team had really tuned us into was what was great about this RCT data was it's not just that the average was great, it's actually when you unpack the subgroups, there's like surprisingly robust data across. And this was one of the most fun things that they did for us. This is oral reading fluency, so it's number of correct words per minute. Across the 50 different communities where we ran the RCT. So the red lines are the Luminos program, the blue lines are the control group, and what this crazy wonky chart tells you is that actually in all 50 communities where the Luminos program was running, children had material learning gains. And so the ID Insight team really loves to hold that up as a story of kind of the and obviously there's a range, but to their mind they had said, we've never really seen that before, where sort of every single location has seen positive learning gains. So this was really exciting. We were feeling great. We were like, wow, we went after education equity and like mission accomplished, we achieved it. But there's always more of the story. Oh, okay. But first we're going to celebrate ourselves one more time. Also, that is not just true for our Liberia program. So this is an analysis of every single data point across every single program that we've run since inception, splitting them all by gender. So it's nice because it's a very similar program. Year in and year out, you can actually look at this data across all of them. And summing it up, what we see, yellow is girls, red is boys, really similar level proportion of girls and boys enrolled in the program to begin with. We see they're averaging really great learning gains, very similar results. They're transitioning to mainstream school at very similar results. They're attending our program at very similar rates. They're completing, and then their long-term, that longitudinal study, seeing really broadly the same long-term success rates for gender, which is amazing, and that's a wonderful thing to see. And obviously, we celebrate that. But yes, it is a slightly more complex story. So, yes, those are wonderful results by subgroup, but there is still a diversity of learning within the Luminos program. So this is from our Luminos Liberia program the year before the RCT, actually. So this is very similar to what we see at the baseline, year in and year out. So here in this baseline, students were reading an average of 1.5 words per minute on the EGRA baseline. And that's pretty much what we see in the country context every year. And funnily enough, it's what we see in Ghana, our wealthiest country, and in Liberia, our poorest country. And that's because marginalized kids are marginalized kids, right? And it doesn't actually matter what country context you're in. If you've been excluded, your reading scores are going to reflect that. But anyway, we're always starting with this kind of universally low baseline. But what's so interesting, and then obviously there's a few high flyers, but not many, right? Most kiddos are right here. What's so interesting, this is just 3 months into the program, that same data set, right? Suddenly, wow, so on the one hand, good news, we've had average phenomenal gains. We've had a 15 words per minute in just 3 months. By the way, this will be like 2 or 3 times what the average second or third grader is reading in Ghana. So that's like in 3 months. That is amazing. We could spend a lot of time celebrating that incredible average gain, but then we could also be blind to the fact that, wow, this is still a really wide distribution of scores. And this is just 3 months in. And what we find in the 10-month program, by the end of the 10 months, that dispersion is even bigger, right? So this becomes one of the gifts of, tackling education equity is it's not just a matter of belief and values, it's actually a matter of data and systems as well, right? It's not enough to say, like, we're committed to blah, 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 blah. You really actually have to unpack what's really happening for the learning journey of our students. So we saw this, and it was a real cause for concern. And in fact, when you looked at a dispersion of our ACRE scores over time in Liberia, and this is that same amazing country context that had the RCT that everybody in the world celebrated, and it was awesome, but actually there are still students being left behind, and it's a sort of persistent, as you can see, kind of 20% of students in 2020, 21, 22, who were really struggling to achieve the basics. And so for all of those amazing average results, there's still a stubborn 1 in 5 students in our classrooms who are being left behind. So after this RCT got us so fired up at looking at equity data, we started unpacking all this other stuff. We were like, we love those RCT results, but we can't abide this idea that there's 1 in 5 students in our classrooms who are really not managing to help meet the basics. And so we developed a remediation program within the context of the remediation program. So within those first 3 months, right when you see that dispersion of scores, we identify those students now in the classroom who are struggling, and those students get extra hours of instruction. And it's a fairly blunt instrument. We identify these students once. We can't actually afford to keep assessing. And then they are in additional after-school programming through the end of the year. But now, that we're 2 years later, I can show you what's happened. Which is like in that same program, by using this education equity data lens, by targeting additional support to the children who are struggling, we've actually directed to 0 students in the library program who are struggling to master the basics. Which is such a powerful reminder that looking at equity and looking at equity again in new and different and deeper ways actually unlocks a level of performance for the program, and most importantly for everyone child that we serve in really profound ways, right? In the end, there was nothing inherent in these children that was causing 1 in 5 of them to be left behind, right? We just hadn't provided enough of the right kind of support to get them where they deserve to be. So I am super excited, and I was chatting with Professor Wagner this morning before we were in a session that this is the very beginning, I think, of unpacking learnings that we have achieved, but there are so many more that we can learn from here about how we understand not just the program as a social justice program, but actual social justice within the context of the program itself. And so that's a quick run on equity, and then there's the Luminos Method book. We are just about at time, and I want to make sure we have a chance to give a copy of the book to as many of you as possible. One of the things we found over time is that a variety of students and nonprofit leaders and kind of even single-site schools will reach out to us and say, can you help us with catch-up education? And we always want to be helpful, but there's kind of only so much we can do from afar. We can only be in so many places. And so as a part of our 10-year anniversary, we actually took the decision to distill down the 9 core practices
that are fundamental to our work at Luminos, but honestly are equally fundamental to just all of the education curriculum. So what we've done in the book is put together for each of these 9 pillars a quick rundown on what is the state of literature, what do we know as a sector about each one of these key elements. What is the actual practice at Luminos, so how are we bringing this to life in the classroom setting, and then what data or evidence do we have to show that it's working. And we have a bunch of copies today for anyone who's interested. I think we're about half programs. So I want to make sure you have a chance to grab one of those on your way out. It looks like this. So it's sort of textbook style. And the most important way that we use this book now is with our government partners. And I think it's been really invaluable to be able to give people a real sense of, like, if you're signing on to a partnership with Luminos, what are you signing up for? So it's made it a lot more tangible and really enabled us to bring our work to life, especially in regions and challenges. So I'm thrilled I can share the book with all of you. But my gratitude to everyone here for the chance to be with you today, and for sharing your research with me, which I think is continues to be an inspiration and a jumping off point for us to think about our own program, think about our continuous improvement journey. And I'm so grateful to have had the chance to spend time with you all. Well, also, the books are here, and they're not coming home with me, so don't feel too inhibited. Thank you. Okay. Thank you all so much. Yeah, I'm happy to help pass out, and then I think that I'm seeing like a subset of